Hello all, welcome back to BA Creative. First things first, my husband read through all of the comments that you guys left him from last week's video, and he wanted me to say thank you so much for all the love and support that you guys showed him. He did a really good job, maybe a little too good. He asked me the other day if I wanted his autograph, and you know what? Honestly, I couldn't tell if he was joking or not, so it's become a little hard to live with. Thanks for that. Thanks, Internet. But he will definitely be making some more appearances in future videos. So for this week's video, I was making the my art journal page for the Dina Wakley May Show Us Your Media Gratitude Challenge. And if you're not familiar with that, you can totally check it out on our blog. I will put a link to that below in the description box. I started by laying down a whole bunch of torn book paper over the page because the prompt this month was stillness. And as soon as I saw that prompt, I knew exactly what I wanted to do, which is a little unusual for me. I usually have to play around a little bit before I know exactly where I'm going with something. But this prompt really spoke to me, primarily because I am such a huge fan of Agnes Martin. So this entire page was inspired by the incredible abstract work of that artist. Like I said, I started by just laying down a whole bunch of collage. I covered it with gesso, and now I'm going back through with one of the Dina Wakley stencils. Check the description box below for a list of the full supplies. So usually I kind of just do what I want, but I'm trying to follow the advice of really amazing artists like Dina Wakley, and she always suggests repetition. Repetition in your artwork is what really brings a cohesiveness to it and makes it better. So I'm primarily working with just two stencils that are both circle shapes. The small one that had that cascading that you just saw me applying some of her paint through, and this larger one that I'll actually wind up using for a collage element later. I'm also sticking to the same color palette, and these are Dina Wakley Heavy Body acrylics in colors that I typically don't work. I just don't work in them. They're very soft, they're very muted. But if you look at the work of Agnes Martin, that's primarily the color palette that she worked in. And interestingly enough, she always worked in acrylics. So this part right here is the focal point of my piece, and it's really the ode to Agnes Martin. Agnes was obsessed with grid lines. Sorry, I don't intend this to be like an art history lesson, but her whole philosophy about her art was also just as inspiring as the art itself. So I can't really talk about what I'm doing without totally talking about her as well. I am starting by laying down a wash over a regular tag, and this is something that Agnes would do a lot when she started all of her pieces. She would thin out acrylic paint and then lay like I just said, a wash of the acrylic over. She also had a tendency to work in either the same color palette, and a lot of her work was very monotone, so she would use different shades and hues of the same color. I am intending to only really work in 3 colors, and I believe it was apricot, heather, and elephant. And I'm laying a wash of each color over the tag so that I can kind of incorporate those elements that are already on the page onto the tag. Now, this is where I make my grid. Agnes was, not that we're on a first name basis, but, Agnes was totally obsessed with mathematics and grid lines. In fact, all of her artwork is really formulated around a grid. And I watched this awesome video from the Smithsonian Institute about how to paint in the style of, and I'll put a link to that below if you're interested in exploring this more. And he really showed how Agnes started all of her paintings, and it was exactly like this. She used a regular old pencil, a regular old ruler, and would draw grids. What I found most interesting about her philosophy was that she never actually made a completely mathematically accurate grid in any of her paintings, and she knew that, and she was okay with it. If I guess she had kind of like a margin of error she was comfortable with. Knowing that it wasn't perfect, she still continued working. However, if it got to the point where she just hated it or she messed up too bad, and I love this, she just trashed it. She didn't hem and haw over it. She didn't try to fix it. She would just trash it and start over. And there was something about that quality to her that really spoke to me. You can see me embracing that as I'm finishing off this grid. If you've noticed that the lines are not really straight, even using the media mat grid and a ruler, I have accepted my, or rather, I've decided what my acceptable margin of error was, and I was okay that this was a little askew. I don't know if this would have been okay for Agnes or not, but for me, it was fine, and I decided to keep going. So after she would lay a wash down, the next thing that she would do is to apply paint, much like how I'm applying it here, in each of the grid boxes. And depending on the size of the grids that she would make, she may have several little slashes or dashes. But she was really into symmetry, so she liked to play with the juxtaposition of different symmetrical elements. So while her grid may go one way, her slashes and dashes may go another. And you can kind of see a little bit of that in this tag. I'm using the color Rosy over top of the tag, just because that's still in that same color palette, and I wanted that monochrome effect that she was really well known for. So this is what the finished piece looks like, and don't get real attached to that, because I too like to play with my own type of juxtaposition between two conflicting elements, as you will see here shortly. So what I've done now is I have cut out a piece of the canvas from that Dina Wakley Media journal. I'm not doing anything else with it. I don't use it, so I'm like, how can I get some more Martin-ish elements into this page? And one of her paintings that I particularly like had really large oval shapes on it, so this is how I am bringing that into my page. I just traced the outline through the stencil and then cut it out. It was nothing fancy, but the color doesn't really match. I mean, it was okay, but I wanted again to bring in some of that color from the page itself. And I started with olive because that was the very first color I laid down. It was the only time I used it. It's right in the background. I was talking over the top of that, so sorry. But I am adding just a little bit more of that as the very first color that I lay down on those little canvas collage elements. Now I'm taking that exact same stencil that I used on the actual page, and I'm going back through it over the collaged pieces of canvas so that it has a little bit of texture, and it's going to kind of soften up the cream color of the canvas. I don't know. I just wanted it to look a little bit more like my page. I don't really have like a super artsy explanation for how to do that. I just wanted it to blend in, if that's an actual artistic term. So now I'm applying my focal point, and like I said earlier, I too like to play around with contrast. I love symmetry. It's actually really hard for me to put things on a page that are askew or off center, and if you go back through my Instagram or my work, you'll probably notice that. However, I do like the contrast of something that is super symmetrical over something that is super messy, and that's why I decided to rip the tag. I wanted the top part of my art journal page to really reflect that really almost rigid like quality that a lot of her work has, while the bottom part being more abstracty and messy in nature. So I ripped the tag. I'm placing just a cover piece of paper over the top so I don't get, that's Distress ink spray, and Antique Linen I think is the color name. And I want, like I said, I'm trying to get that messy look, and there's no better way to accomplish that than by drip. So I've just sprayed that over. I did forget though that Distress spray has it takes a really long time to dry over gel medium and acrylic. So after I set that with a heat gun, I went back in. See, it's still kind of drippy. I'm gonna hit that with a heat gun again, but you guys won't see that. I mixed in some of the apricot color with a super heavy, thick, like super bright white gesso, because I wanted something really thick to cover up that hard line, but I still wanted to be able to see it just a little bit. Like, I don't know, was I being nitpicky? Maybe, but I really liked the texture that the super thick gesso gives, and I wanted a little drippy, so I'm going back and I'm hitting it with a crap ton of water. Like, that was that was like a good 2 or 3 tablespoons, and the gesso was so thick I still have to use my finger to kind of smush it around a little bit on the page, but I totally dig how it works out. So now I'm adding in my collage elements. You may have noticed that I originally only cut out 5 because typically I do everything in odds, but it just didn't look right. So I went back and I cut back one more and just added that back in. And I really like that. I loved how it was starting to come together. I took a Stabilo all pencil and graphite and started making just little random marks on the page. The cool thing was I discovered if I didn't like the mark, because there was so much gel medium and acrylic on this, that I could literally just wipe it up with a wet baby wipe. As you were seeing here, I didn't like that. So I left the little random scratch marks from the pencil down in the bottom between the oval shapes, and I think that turned out really well. I was pleased with that. I took a scrap piece of the canvas, ran it through my sewing machine, and adhered it to the bottom of the page, which is currently out of frame. My bad, sorry. Now I'm taking some sari ribbon and I'm tying it through the tag just to add a little bit more color and texture. Now it's my time for the sentiment. I stamped out Stillness because that was Dina's prompt name for the month, and like I always do, I'm just adhering it to the page. Agnes Martin's work was always about something positive, and I always found it to be very quiet. So I knew immediately when I saw this that I wanted to do an ode to Agnes for this prompt. I hope you guys enjoyed this. As always, thank you so much, and I will see you next time.